The cold wind bit at Eliza's cheeks as she tightened her scarf, trying to keep warm against the evening chill. The grocery bag in her hand was a bit too light. Really, she thought, feeling the sharp pang of worry in her stomach. That night's dinner would stretch her last few dollars to their breaking point, but she'd worked wonders with less before. Her little boy, Liam, was waiting at home, and she knew he'd be excited for even the simplest meal if it came with one of her bedtime stories. She tried to ignore the knots of anxiety that came with each step closer to home, telling herself it would be okay, somehow. Just as she rounded the corner near her apartment, she noticed a figure hunched on the steps of a boarded-up shop, shoulders hunched against the cold. The man looked exhausted, his clothes worn thin and patched in places. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket for a coin or two, glancing up and catching her gaze with a look of raw desperation. He looked young, maybe in his early 20s, but life had clearly been hard on him. Eliza felt a tug at her heart, stronger than the usual pang of empathy. It was as if she could see herself in his weary expression, the hopelessness of being at the end of your rope, having no one to turn to. Her hand tightened around her own meager handful of cash, a little left over after the groceries, not enough to even cover the rent due in a few days. She knew she could use every penny she had, but something in her heart refused to let her walk away. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind as she approached him. "Do you need help?" The man looked up, startled, his eyes glistening with a combination of shame and gratitude. He didn't speak, just nodded, and she could tell from the way he averted his eyes that he was struggling to hold on to whatever pride he had left. Without a word, she took the crumpled bills from her pocket and pressed them into his hand. It wasn't much, but it would buy him a warm meal, maybe even a night at the shelter. He looked down at the money, then back at her with a mixture of disbelief and relief, as though he couldn't quite comprehend that someone would help him, especially when she looked as if she could use the help herself. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to thank you." Eliza gave him a gentle smile. "Take care of yourself," she said, then turned to leave, feeling a strange lightness settle over her. She knew she'd done the right thing, though she had no idea how she'd make it through the week herself. As she walked away, she didn't see the young man watching her, his gaze full of silent promises, or the thoughtful expression that replaced his look of despair. He tucked the bills into his pocket, his hands no longer shaking, and turned into the night with a new sense of purpose. The next week started like any other, with Eliza navigating the daily balancing act of work, childcare, and the endless worries that came with living paycheck to paycheck. Liam was her world, her reason for everything, and she poured every ounce of love into the little joys they shared: a handmade breakfast, stories she invented at bedtime, and small outings to the park. She found joy in his laughter, his boundless curiosity, his belief that she could do anything, even when she barely believed it herself. One morning, as she was tidying up their small living room, a letter arrived in the mail. She nearly overlooked it, dismissing it as yet another bill, but the envelope felt strangely heavy in her hands. She turned it over, noting the crisp, professional lettering with her son's name on it. Frowning, she tore it open, her heart pounding as she skimmed the contents. Inside was a letter informing her that Liam had been awarded a scholarship, something she'd never applied for. It was for a private school known for its excellent programs, its nurturing environment, and its impressive resources for young students. They provided not only a full academic scholarship but also assistance with meals, books, and even extracurriculars. Eliza felt her hands begin to shake. It was almost impossible to believe. This school was something she'd only dreamed of for Liam, a place where he could thrive, surrounded by opportunity and support she could never provide on her own. She scanned the page again, sure she must have misunderstood. But it was real. Her son, her bright, curious Liam, had been given a chance she'd never thought possible. And all she could think of was the man on the street corner, the few crumpled bills, and the look of gratitude in his eyes. She clutched the letter to her chest, tears springing to her eyes as she let herself imagine, for the first time in a long time, that things could be different. The next few days were a blur as she went through the process of confirming the scholarship, meeting with the school staff, and making the arrangements for Liam's enrollment. They welcomed her with warmth, assuring her that all expenses were covered, and even gave her a tour of the campus. She was struck by the kindness in their voices, their clear dedication to each child's growth and happiness. She watched as Liam's eyes grew wide, taking in the library, the science labs, and the art rooms filled with supplies and colors he'd never seen before. On their way home, he chattered excitedly, asking her questions about his new school, wondering if he'd make friends, talking about all the things he wanted to learn. She listened, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But even as life seemed to brighten, Eliza couldn't shake the mystery of it all. Who had nominated Liam for the scholarship? No one at the school had been able to answer her questions. The donor was anonymous. She wondered if it was some sort of miracle, a gift she'd been given in return for helping that stranger on the street. The thought lingered in her mind, a quiet, humbling reminder of how small acts of kindness could ripple in ways she'd never imagined. One evening, as she tucked Liam into bed, he looked up at her with those bright, curious eyes of his. "Mama, do you think there are magic people?" he asked, his voice soft and serious. She smiled, brushing a hand over his forehead. "I think there are people who bring magic into the world just by being kind," she said. "Sometimes, all it takes is one small thing to make someone's whole life brighter." As he drifted to sleep, she sat by his bedside, thinking of how much her life had changed in just a few short days. Her heart was full, her mind at peace. Whatever strange twist of fate had brought them this gift, she was grateful, beyond words, and she knew she'd carry the memory of that cold night and the stranger with her forever. In the weeks that followed, life continued its steady rhythm, each day bringing small moments of happiness and stability. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself to feel hope, to dream a little bigger, to believe that kindness had a way of coming back to those who gave it freely. A few weeks later, as Eliza walked Liam to school, she felt lighter than she had in years. Watching him skip along, a spring in his step, she could hardly believe this was the same child who used to carry so much of her worry in his eyes. This school had given him more than just academics. It had given him a safe place to learn and grow, surrounded by teachers who nurtured his talents and peers who sparked his curiosity. She watched as he ran up the steps of the school, waving goodbye before dashing off to meet his new friends. With a deep breath, Eliza turned back toward home, her thoughts still buzzing with wonder and gratitude. She couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of awe at how things had shifted so suddenly, as if a hidden door had opened just when she needed it most. She felt stronger, even empowered, knowing her kindness had somehow come back to her tenfold. As she walked along the sidewalk, her thoughts drifted back to the young man she'd met on the street that cold night. She couldn't shake the feeling that he'd played a part in this somehow. Though she knew it was probably just a coincidence, the timing was too perfect, too aligned to ignore. She hadn't seen him since, but she kept an eye out on her walks, wondering if he'd ever show up again. That afternoon, as she busied herself tidying their small apartment, there was a knock at the door. Eliza opened it to find her neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, standing there with her usual warm smile. Harlan had lived in the building for years, always ready to lend a hand or share a bit of gossip from the other tenants. "Eliza, dear," she began, "I wanted to see if you'd be interested in a little extra work. My sister's catering company is short-staffed this season, and I told her you might be perfect for it. She's looking for reliable help, and I know you've got a knack in the kitchen." The offer caught Eliza off guard. An extra job would mean a lot, especially now with the scholarship covering Liam's schooling but little else. She imagined what even a small income boost might do, how she might save a little, get some more reliable shoes for Liam, or finally take care of the persistent leak in their bathroom. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Harlan," she replied, her heart lifting at the thought. "Thank you so much for thinking of me." Mrs. Harlan beamed, nodding in satisfaction. "I thought you'd say yes. I'll let my sister know she's got herself a helper." The first few shifts at the catering company were grueling but fulfilling. Eliza worked long hours, chopping vegetables, arranging hors d'oeuvres, and sometimes working late into the night for events that required meticulous attention. But she found joy in the work. even though her hands ached by the end of the day. She was grateful to be able to contribute, to carve out a little more for herself and for Liam. As the weeks went by, she grew accustomed to the routine, balancing her catering shifts with her full-time job. She learned the names of the regular staff, became friends with the chefs, and even began developing a reputation as someone they could count on when the pressure mounted. It was exhausting but satisfying, and every time she cashed her check, she felt a sense of accomplishment that was new and empowering. Then, one night as she was packing up after a particularly large event, she caught sight of someone standing near the back entrance. It was the same young man she'd helped that night in front of the store, the one she'd given her last few dollars to. He was dressed a little better now, in clean clothes that looked warm enough to hold off the chill of the evening. He looked at her with a smile of recognition, almost as if he'd been waiting for her. "Eliza," he said softly. As she approached him, her surprise evident. She didn't remember telling him her name that night, but he seemed to know it now, and somehow, it didn't feel strange. I had to find you and say thank you," he continued, his voice sincere and filled with gratitude. "You helped me when no one else would. That night, it meant more than you could know." Eliza looked at him, her mind racing with questions. "But how did you find me?" The young man's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Let's just say I had a little help, and I wanted to make sure the help I received went to someone deserving. What you gave that night, it was more than just money. You gave me back my hope, and I knew I had to find a way to repay you." Before she could ask more, he took a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, unsure of what to say or think. But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a letter with a name she recognized, an organization that offered grants and financial aid to single parents trying to pursue their own dreams. It seemed impossible, but here it was, an opportunity, a way to not only support Liam but also to carve a future for herself, to pursue dreams she'd long buried. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she looked back up at him. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. This could change everything." The young man nodded, a look of quiet satisfaction in his gaze. "That's what kindness does," he said softly. "It changes things. One small act can turn a life around." And with a final nod, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving her standing there, clutching the envelope to her chest. In the weeks that followed, Eliza found herself filled with a new sense of purpose. The grant from the organization helped cover her expenses, giving her a cushion she'd never known before. With this support, she was able to cut back on her work hours, spending more time with Liam and even enrolling in an evening course at the community college. It was something she'd always dreamed of, but had never thought possible. She knew that her son was watching her, absorbing the lessons of resilience and hope she was trying to teach him, just as much as she was learning them herself. One evening, as they sat together over a modest but warm dinner, Liam looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Mama, did you ever find out who gave us that scholarship?" he asked, his young eyes bright with curiosity. Eliza shook her head, smiling. "No, sweetheart. I don't know exactly who, but I know it was someone very kind. And that's what matters, isn't it? Sometimes we don't need to know who helped us to be grateful." He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. But as they finished their meal, Eliza thought of the stranger once more, of his mysterious appearance and the way he'd changed her life without even knowing her. She felt that she had been given not just a gift but also a responsibility to pay forward the kindness she'd received in ways she hadn't yet imagined. That winter, Eliza's life took on a new rhythm. The days were filled with work and study, but each step forward was a reminder of how far she'd come. The grant allowed her to invest in herself, giving her the confidence and means to dream again. And with every small success, she felt that invisible thread connecting her to the young man who had once been a stranger on the street. As spring blossomed, she watched as Liam continued to thrive, his joy and curiosity boundless. He excelled in his studies, brought home art projects, and talked endlessly about science and stories he'd learned in school. And though Eliza knew she had been the one to give him his foundation, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the chance she'd been given to build a life they could both be proud of. And so, each evening when she tucked Liam into bed, she whispered a silent thank you to the universe, to the stranger, and to the kindness that had bound them all in a way she could never have foreseen. Because sometimes, a single act of kindness was all it took to change a life. And in her heart she knew she would carry that gift with her forever, passing it forward with every chance she was given. In the months that followed, Eliza felt as if she were living in a quiet miracle. Her small apartment still had its creaks and quirks, but it felt like home now more than ever. There was a warmth that filled each room, a sense of belonging and possibility she hadn't known in years. With Liam thriving at his new school and her own classes keeping her busy, life felt like it was finally moving forward. She had even started to dream again, small dreams, perhaps, but ones she could believe in. One evening, as she picked Liam up from school, he came bounding out of the building with his usual energy, clutching a small, handmade card in his hand. He ran up to her, eyes alight with excitement. "Look, Mama. We had a kindness project at school, and I made this for you," he said, thrusting the card into her hands with a proud grin. She opened it to see a drawing of the two of them, hand in hand, surrounded by stars and hearts. Underneath, in his unsteady handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for being my hero." The simple words hit her with a wave of emotion, bringing tears to her eyes. She hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "You're my hero too, Liam," she whispered, holding him close. That evening, as they shared dinner, Eliza found herself reflecting on the stranger who had brought them to this moment. She had come to think of him as an angel of sorts, someone who'd appeared in her life at exactly the right time to change its course. She knew she'd never see him again, but the gift he had given her the strength to keep going, the hope that had blossomed anew, was something she would carry forever. As spring turned to summer, Eliza's life continued to blossom in unexpected ways. Her coursework was going well, and she had even been invited to apply for a full-time position at the catering company, one that offered benefits and better pay than she'd ever had before. It was an opportunity she could scarcely believe, one that would allow her to give Liam an even better future while building a career she enjoyed. One warm afternoon, she took Liam to the neighborhood park to celebrate the end of his school year. They shared an ice cream, laughing as they sat under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. While Liam played with some other children nearby, Eliza watched him, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment. She thought back to the challenges they'd faced, to the endless worry, and to the unexpected kindness that had changed everything. As they got up to leave, Eliza noticed a man sitting alone on a nearby bench, looking down at his hands. He was older, wearing a faded jacket, and there was a weary look in his eyes that she recognized all too well. Without hesitation, she walked over, feeling that familiar tug at her heart. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle but certain, "would you like some help?" The man looked up, surprised, and she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a flicker she knew could be fanned into something bigger. She reached into her pocket and handed him a few bills she had set aside for such moments. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that he wasn't alone. As they walked home, she looked down at Liam, who was watching her with quiet curiosity. She took his hand, smiling softly as they strolled under the warm glow of the evening sun. "You know, Liam," she said, "sometimes the smallest kindness can change someone's whole world." He nodded, as if understanding on a level deeper than words, and together they walked on, knowing that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a thread of kindness woven through time and people, unbreakable and enduring. And as Eliza tucked Liam into bed that night, she whispered a final thank you to the universe, to the stranger, and to the journey that had taught her the power of compassion. She knew, in her heart, that they were all part of a story far greater than their own, one in which love and kindness could change lives, if only people were brave enough to reach out.